Audio Renaissance presents The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein, read for you by Jennifer Wiltsie.
Introduction. Blank is beautiful. 3 decades of erasing and remaking the world. I met Jamar Perry in September 2005 at the big Red Cross shelter in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Dinner was being doled out by grinning young Scientologists, and he was standing in line. I had just been busted for talking to evacuees without a media escort, and was now doing my best to blend in, a white Canadian in a sea of African-American Southerners. I dodged into the food line behind Perry and asked him to talk to me as if we were old friends, which he kindly did. Born and raised in New Orleans, he'd been out of the flooded city for a week. He looked about 17 but told me he was 23. He and his family had waited forever for the evacuation buses. When they didn't arrive, they had walked out in the baking sun. Finally, they ended up here, a sprawling convention center, normally home to pharmaceutical trade shows and capital city carnage, the ultimate in steel cage fighting. Now jammed with 2,000 cots and a mess of angry, exhausted people being patrolled by edgy National Guard soldiers just back from Iraq. The news racing around the shelter that day was that Richard Baker, a prominent Republican congressman from this city, had told a group of lobbyists, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did." Joseph Cannizzaro, one of New Orleans' wealthiest developers, had just expressed a similar sentiment. "I think we have a clean sheet to start again. And with that clean sheet, we have some very big opportunities." All that week, the Louisiana State Legislature in Baton Rouge had been crawling with corporate lobbyists helping to lock in those big opportunities. Lower taxes, fewer regulations, cheaper workers, and a smaller, safer city, which in practice meant leveling the public housing projects and replacing them with condos. Hearing all the talk of fresh starts and clean sheets, you could almost forget the toxic stew of rubble, chemical outflows, and human remains just a few miles down the highway. Over at the shelter, Jamar could think of nothing else. "I really don't see it as cleaning up the city. What I see is that a lot of people got killed uptown. People who shouldn't have died." He was speaking quietly, but an older man in line in front of us overheard and whipped around. "What is wrong with people in Baton Rouge? This is an opportunity. It's a goddamn tragedy. Are they blind? Painful, and they knew everyone. The opportunity to government should provide families with vouchers, which they could spend at private institutions, many run at a profit, that would be subsidized by the state." A network of right-wing think tanks seized on Friedman's proposal and descended on the city after the storm. The administration of George W. Bush backed up their plans with tens of millions of dollars to convert New Orleans schools into charter schools, publicly funded schools run by private entities according to their own rules. Charter schools are deeply polarizing in the United States, and nowhere more than in New Orleans, where they are seen by many African-American parents as a way of reversing the gains of the civil rights movement, which guaranteed all children the same standard of education. For Milton Friedman, however, the entire concept of a state-run school system reeked of socialism. In his view, the state's sole functions were to protect our freedom both from the enemies outside our gates and from our fellow citizens, to preserve law and order, to enforce private contracts, to foster competitive markets. In other words, to supply the police and the soldiers. Anything else, including providing free education, was an unfair interference in the market. In sharp contrast to the glacial pace with which the levees were repaired and the electricity grid was brought back online, the auctioning off of New Orleans' school system took place with military speed and precision. Within 19 months, with most of the city's poor residents still in exile, New Orleans' public school system had been almost completely replaced by privately run charter schools.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?